As we've seen, incorporating connectivity into conservation requires collaboration across many jurisdictions. In this video, we will look more in depth at why such collaboration is essential, as well as some examples from around the world where it has been tried. First, let's make the distinction between natural and political borders. Natural borders are physical barriers on the landscape that hinder or completely prevent species from moving across the landscape. What exactly constitutes a border depends on the particular species in question, and they could be natural features like mountain chains or rivers, but also anthropogenic features like cities or intensive agricultural areas. On the other hand, political borders may be less visible on the landscape. Political borders divide landscapes into countries, provinces, states, municipalities, and other jurisdictions. Wildlife and nature more broadly doesn't adhere to man-made borders. Around the world, many wildlife migrations cross international borders, meaning that no one country can completely protect them. For example, the porcupine caribou herd migrates across 1,500 kilometers of Arctic tundra from the Yukon to their calving grounds in northern Alaska. Similarly, many individual animals' home ranges span borders. The idea of Y2Y emerged from wildlife tracking studies in the early 1990s, which showed that grizzly bears, wolves, and cougars were all roaming over huge areas of the Rocky Mountains, spanning across the United States-Canada border. The most famous of these animals was Pluie, a wolf who was originally collared in Alberta, but was then tracked traveling over 10,000 kilometers in a year and a half, roaming through Montana, Idaho, Washington State, and British Columbia before coming back to Alberta. While there may be a physical barrier along a border, such as the US-Mexico border wall, many political borders aren't really noticeable at all. For example, most of the Canada-US border is unfenced, and often when you drive across a provincial border, the only way that you know that you've done so is that there's a sign welcoming you to a new province. But just because there isn't a physical barrier at a political border, it doesn't mean that wildlife are unaffected by the border, as there might be different policies, legal or institutional structures, management and government regimes, or social, cultural, and economic contexts on either side of the line. For example, a species may be protected from being hunted on one side of the border, but not on the other. The point is that no one jurisdiction can completely protect something that isn't entirely under their control. Collaboration across borders is necessary. To overcome political boundaries that don't always make sense through an ecological lens, transboundary conservation slowly evolved over the course of the 20th century through the development of transboundary protected areas, which are protected areas that span across more than one country, province, or state. They're also sometimes called transfrontier conservation areas or peace parks, a nod to the fact that sometimes the countries working together on these conservation efforts are not always on the best of terms with one another, and are sometimes even actively engaged in war. Every transboundary protected area is different and reflects the unique cultural context that they operate within, and they all have their own unique management and governance structures. They are also all established for different reasons. Many are established for ecological reasons, like the preservation of key wildlife migration corridors, but they also may be established to preserve critical resources for human populations, like the protection of a river that provides drinking water or a source of irrigation for agriculture. Let's take a look at a few examples of transboundary protected areas from around the world. We've been discussing the Yellowstone to Yukon region quite a bit this week. Within this region, the US-Canada border presents an interesting challenge for conservation. While the Y2Y organization as a whole spans across the border, most of the individual protected areas within the system fall within a single jurisdiction, the exception being the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. This protected area complex covers the Continental Divide at the border between Alberta and Montana. Ecologically speaking, it's a pretty unique area because there are prairie ecosystems nestled right up against the Rocky Mountains with no foothills in between, which is pretty rare. Between the two parks, you'll also find the headwaters of 3 major watersheds, which eventually flow into 3 different oceans. Waterton Glacier was actually the first international peace park established way back in 1932, when Waterton Lakes National Park in southern Alberta was expanded to meet the border of Montana's Glacier National Park. The move was the result of advocacy from Rotary clubs on both sides of the border, who saw the importance of the region and the need for both countries to work together to protect the ecosystem. It was also recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995 as a testament to the ability for conservation to promote goodwill between nations and to underscore the international nature of conservation. Currently, the two national parks that make up this peace park are managed and protected under their respective national legislative frameworks, and each has their own park management plan. However, there are a number of jointly agreed upon guiding principles used to develop these plans, and plans are frequently reviewed by officials on the other side of the border. Transboundary conservation efforts have also had a lot of success in Africa. One example is the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park, which is comprised of Limpopo National Park in Mozambique, Kruger National Park in South Africa, and Ngorongoro National Park in Zimbabwe. The larger area also includes Banheen and Zinave National Parks, as well as a number of privately owned conservation areas in South Africa and Zimbabwe, meaning there are opportunities to expand this protected area system in the future. In total, the Transfrontier Park covers about 35,000 square kilometers, which is an area a little bit larger than the Netherlands. And it's mostly savanna and scrubland, which supports a wide variety of wildlife, including elephants, rhinos, giraffes, leopards, and lions. Although some of the individual protected areas in this complex are quite old, the Kruger was first protected in 1898, the Transfrontier Park was officially established in 2002 through a treaty that also created a joint management board to oversee issues related to conservation, safety, finance, legislation, and tourism in the region. The coordination and leadership of the board rotates between the three countries every 2 years. One of the major goals of the park was to ensure that local communities across the region will benefit from increased ecotourism, especially in Mozambique, which is still dealing with the social disruption from its civil war in the 1970s and 1980s. So the development of the Transfrontier Park was done through heavy community consultation, and the communities are also involved with management decision on land use in the region. One of the big goals in doing so is to reduce poaching in the area, especially of rhino, which are critically endangered. Poaching is incredibly economically lucrative, but the hope is that by involving communities in conservation management decision-making, and by providing jobs in ecotourism and anti-poaching efforts, they will be able to reduce poaching. Sometimes opportunities for connectivity conservation emerge out of unusual circumstances. From the end of the Second World War until 1989, Europe was disconnected by a strip of barbed wire, minefields, watchdogs, and gun towers. The so-called Iron Curtain was a brutal symbol of the hostility between the East and the West, between communism and capitalism. But by excluding people, the border zone unwittingly welcomed nature. Ecosystems ranging from Arctic tundra to forest to alpine meadows all flourished alongside the Iron Curtain during its decades-long existence. And as early as the 1960s, scientists on both sides noted that it was a really biodiverse area. All along the Iron Curtain, pockets of wilderness were left untouched for decades, sheltering rare birds, elk, bears, and wild orchids. Following the collapse of the Iron Curtain in 1989, conservation initiatives began to spring up all along its former path, including cross-border cooperation among neighboring countries that were only just starting to emerge from decades of mistrust with one another. In 2002, a German-based conservation organization proposed the creation of a pan-European greenbelt spanning the length of the entire former Iron Curtain, which they dubbed the Green Curtain. The Green Curtain extends about 12,500 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Black and Mediterranean Seas in the south, running through 24 different countries across the continent. To picture just how large this effort is, this is roughly the same distance as Vancouver to Sydney, Nova Scotia, and back again. To help with the management of the Green Curtain and to work to establish more protected areas along its path, the European Greenbelt is divided into 4 regional sections, and it also actually has its own working group within the IUCN, which acts as a politically neutral coordinator for its implementation. In addition to the ecological values of an area left relatively undisturbed for decades, the European Greenbelt is also an area of cultural importance and includes several physical monuments to the Cold War, though many also consider the Greenbelt itself to be a living monument to the era. Although a lot of border regions have resulted in conservation success stories, we can't ignore the fact that many human political borders create challenges for wildlife and conservation. One example of this is the border wall between the United States and Mexico. Stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico, the 3,000-kilometer-long border region is really rich in biodiversity, and the existing and potential future extensions of the border wall threaten some of the continent's most biodiverse regions, and threatens to reduce the area, quality, and connectivity of habitats in the region. Recent research has also indicated that the proposed expansions of the wall by former US President Donald Trump would threaten the habitat and movement of 93 different vulnerable and endangered species. Like any large-scale development, the construction of the wall and its associated infrastructure, like roads and operating bases, will degrade natural vegetation and fragment habitats into smaller, more vulnerable and isolated patches, and disrupt fire and hydrological processes. The physical barrier of the border wall prevents, or at least discourages, wildlife from crossing the border, which prevents them from accessing key habitat resources and disrupts annual or seasonal migrations and dispersal routes. For example, the construction of the border wall has made it virtually impossible for endangered species like the Mexican gray wolf and Sonoran pronghorn from moving between California and Mexico, and experts are saying that without intervention, this could lead to their extinction. Overall, transboundary areas represent a unique opportunity to better protect species through coordinated management efforts across borders. However, they're also often politically volatile regions that can create a lot of management challenges.